Welcome back to So You Really Want to Learn Latin. And today we move on to one of my favourite little things in the Latin language, and that is relative clauses. Now, first things first, what on earth is a relative clause? Well, when we say something like, the girl who was walking to school, or the haystack which we saw in the fields, what we're doing is we are using a little clause to tell us something more about a noun that we've just mentioned. So, the girl who was walking to school was happy. Okay? Now, we have a main sentence there. The girl was happy. But we want to know which girl we're talking about. And so we say the girl who was walking to school. That tells us a little bit more about the girl so that we can be sure that we're talking about the right girl. Or the haystack, which we saw in the fields, caught fire. Right, so the main sentence is the haystack caught fire. But which haystack? The one which we saw in the fields. Now, the noun which we are giving a little bit more information about in that relative clause is called the antecedent. Okay, so the girl who was walking to school. The girl is the antecedent. The haystack which we saw in the fields, the haystack is the antecedent. Okay? Now, an antecedent can itself be the subject or the object of its own clause, or indeed it can be in any of the other cases, genitive, dative, or ablative. It can be singular, it can be plural. So, it won't surprise you to know that when we learn the word for who or which in Latin, it's going to have lots of cases and it's going to have two numbers. Okay? So, the relative pronoun. In English, who or which, or whom, if you're being correct and a little bit old-fashioned. In Latin is qui, quae, quod. Okay? And it goes like this. Qui, quae, quod, quem, quam, quod. Cuius, 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 qui, 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 quo, qua, quo. And in the plural, qui, quae, quae, quos, quas, quae, quorum, 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 quibus or quis, 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 quibus or quis. Now, I'm saying quibus or quis because actually, in the dative and ablative plural, the form for the relative pronoun can either be quibus, looking a little bit kind of third declension, or it can be quis, looking a little bit first or second declension. So we learn it as quibus or quis, quibus or quis, quibus or quis. Okay, now, it's really important that we understand this concept of an antecedent, because we're now going to move on and look at a really important rule about relative clauses in Latin, which is that the relative pronoun in Latin takes its gender and its number from the antecedent, but it takes its case from the grammatical position of that pronoun within the relative clause. Okay, now that sounds like a hell of a lot to take in. So let's just break it down and we'll run through 5 examples using 5 cases, just to show you what I mean. Okay, so for example, if we say the woman who is walking, and then we can go on and say something like is happy. Okay, the woman who is walking. In that sentence, the relative pronoun is who, the relative clause is who is walking, and the antecedent, in other words, the noun to which that relative clause is referring is the woman. Okay, now the woman is feminine and singular. So if we were translating that into Latin, our relative pronoun would be feminine and singular, okay? And then, irrespective of what case the woman is in her sentence, we want to know what is the grammatical position of that relative pronoun in the relative clause, which, if you remember, is who is walking. Now, in that little relative clause, who is walking, she is walking, the relative pronoun is the subject of the verb is walking. You could take out who and put in she, and that'll prove what I mean. Who is walking? She is walking. Okay? So the relative pronoun in that sentence would have been quae, feminine and singular, because the antecedent is feminine and singular, and nominative, because it is the subject of the relative clause. So we end up with femina, comma, quae ambulat, comma, and then the sentence will carry on. We want to know, well, what is the woman doing? Okay, second example. The woman whom we love is happy, or whatever. Now, the woman, okay, she's feminine and she's singular. So the relative pronoun is going to be feminine and singular. But this time, just look at that relative clause. The woman whom we love. Now, in the relative clause, the subject of the verb love was we, whom we love. Who did we love? Or whom did we love? Well, we love the woman. So that word whom is in the accusative case. It is the object of the verb love. So when we put that one into Latin, it's feminine and it's singular, but it must be accusative. So we get to quam. Femina, quam amamus, and then it will go on to say whatever it wants to say about woman. You know, she's happy, laeta est, or whatever. Okay, so there's a nominative and accusative, but we can go on. So let's look at this one. The woman whose daughter we love. Okay, and then we'll go on and say she's happy or whatever. So, the woman whose daughter. Now, that relative pronoun in English has become whose, and that means of whom. Okay, so the woman whose daughter, the relative pronoun is still referring to the antecedent, the woman, so femina, and that is feminine and singular. So we're picking a feminine singular relative pronoun, but this time we've put it in the genitive because it's of whom, or in English we say whose. So feminine, genitive, singular, cuius. So we get femina, cuius filiam amamus, of whom we love the daughter. And then the sentence will carry on and we'll say something like laeta est. Okay, you following this? Okay, two to go. Let's have a dative. Same antecedent set up. We're going to have the woman to whom we gave a present. Okay, now to whom, referring back to that antecedent of the woman. That's whom we gave the present to. So we still have our sentence, our basic sentence, the woman, and it goes on. I haven't even bothered to tell you, but it's probably going to be something like the woman is happy. Okay, femina laeta est. But let's learn more about the woman. It is the woman to whom we gave a present. Now that relative pronoun, to whom, it's referring to the woman who's feminine and singular. So it's going to be feminine and singular. But which case? To whom. Dative case. So we're going for quae. It's a rather hard pronoun that. It looks like cooey, and people often go quae, quod, quam, quod, coos, cooey, cooey, cooey. Well, it's actually a diphthong. It's cui. C-U-I is pronounced cui. Okay, so dative singular, cui, and then we gave a present, donum dedimus. Okay, so we get femina, cui donum dedimus later est, or whatever the sentence carries on to say about the woman. And finally, let's show we can do it with an ablative, and surprise, surprise, our antecedent is going to be the same old thing. The woman by whom he was killed is happy. Okay, so femina, the woman. By whom, now, the relative pronoun, whom, referring back to the antecedent of the woman, so feminine and singular, but this time it's going in the ablative. And it's actually going in the ablative after the preposition are or ab. Okay, qua feminine singular ablative, referring back to the antecedent femina. Okay, so femina. A qua interfectus est. And then later est, or whatever we want to say about that woman. Okay, so do you see what's happening there? A relative clause in English tells us a little bit more about a noun that has just been mentioned. That noun, which has just been mentioned, is called the antecedent. The antecedent can be any case it wants to be. Okay, it could be the subject of a sentence, it could be the object of a sentence, it could be in any old case. But the point is, it is a noun that we've just mentioned, and then you get the relative clause telling us something more about it. Okay? And the rule in Latin, which you must not forget, is that the relative pronoun refers back to the antecedent, and it takes its gender and its number from the antecedent, but it takes its case from its grammatical position within its own little relative clause. And so it is perfectly possible, and indeed incredibly common, for the relative pronoun to be in an entirely different case to the antecedent that it's talking about, but it will always, always, always be in the same gender and the same number. Now, the best way to prove that we've really got that nailed is, of course, to do some practice. We'll start off with some English into Latin. Okay, we'll just do 3 or 4 of those, and then we'll look at some Latin into English. Okay, so here we go with the English into Latin, and we're just going to do the kind of front end of these sentences. So we're going to say, the boy who is walking is happy. Okay, main sentence, the boy is happy. Puer laetus est. But we want to know a little bit more about the boy, and we know that it is the boy who is walking. Okay, so the relative pronoun, who, it's going to be a quae, quod word. It's going to take its gender and its number from the antecedent, in this case the boy. So it's going to be masculine and singular. And in the relative clause, who is walking, that word who is the subject of is walking. So we get qui ambulat. Okay, puer qui ambulat laetus est, is happy. The boy is happy. Okay, we'll do another one. The girl who is walking, is happy. Okay? Subject, puella. What is she? Well, she's happy. Laeta est. But we've got a little relative clause there describing what's going on, and it says who is walking, and it's describing that girl. Takes its gender and its number from the antecedent, puella. So it's going to be feminine and singular. And again, in that relative clause, who is walking, just like the first one, it is the subject of is walking. So we get puella, quae ambulat, laeta est. Now, I've said that the antecedent can be in any case. So far, everything we've done, we've had the antecedent actually as the subject of the main sentence. But just imagine if you had a sentence such as, the name of the war which we were waging was the Third Samnite War. Okay, so the name of the war. Okay, nomen, the name. Belli, of the war. Okay, so there you've got a noun in the genitive singular. The name of the war, nomen belli. Comma, which we were waging. Now, the relative pronoun, which, is referring back to a noun we have just mentioned, which in this case was the war. The war is a neuter singular noun. Okay? It happens to be put into the genitive in this sentence, but that's irrelevant. The point is it's neuter and it's singular. So the name of the war, which we were waging. Okay. Now the relative clause, which we were waging, it's got a verb, were waging. The subject of that verb is we, and the object of that verb is which we were waging. In other words, we were waging it. So in this example, the relative pronoun is going to be neuter and singular because the antecedent is neuter and singular, but it's going to be in the accusative case because it is the object of the verb in the relative clause. So we get nomen belli quod gerebamus, which we were waging. And then it'll go on to say was the Third Samnite War. Okay? And then you might have a sentence like, I was walking with a sailor whose mother was sad. Okay? I was walking with a sailor whose mother was sad. The main sentence, I was walking with a sailor whose mother was sad. So, I was walking with a sailor, cum nauta ambulabam, I was walking with a sailor, cum nauta ambulabam. And then what do we know about that sailor? Well, we know her mother was sad. I was walking with a sailor whose mother was sad. The relative pronoun in English is whose. In Latin, it's going to be a quae quod word. It's going to refer back to the antecedent, which was the sailor. I was walking with a sailor whose mother was sad. The sailor is masculine and singular. And then what case will it be in, this relative pronoun? Well, you look at the relative clause, whose mother was sad. Okay? The mother was sad. Whose mother was sad. So that word whose is actually genitive because it is of whom the mother was sad. So the relative clause is going to be cuius, so that's genitive, of whom, It's genitive and masculine and singular. Mater meister erat. Meistus, Latin for sad. Okay, so cum nautar, comma, cuius mater meister erat, comma, ambulabum. I was walking. Okay, whew, that's, it's hard when you're going into Latin, but as I've always said, put it into Latin first, check you know the rules, and then when you see it coming the other way, it should be much easier. So let's have a little look at some going the other way. Okay, nice simple one. Dominus, qui est in horto iratus est. Okay, so you've got the main sentence, Dominus iratus est. The master is angry. But we know something a little bit more about the master because we've got a relative clause tucked inside. They're often tucked inside commas to make them kind of a little bit obvious. And we have qui est in horto, who is in the garden. And that word qui, it's masculine and it's singular because it's referring back to the antecedent, dominus, and it's nominative because it is the subject of the verb in its own little relative clause, qui est in horto, who is in the garden. Okay, and again you'll see that gender of the relative pronoun changing when you get a sentence such as puella quae est in agro cantat. The girl, commas, little relative clause telling us more about the girl, quae est in agro, who is in the field. Now that word quae, referring back to the antecedent, puella, it's feminine, it's singular, because the girl is feminine and singular. But it's nominative because it is the subject of the verb in the relative clause, quae est in agro, who is in the field. And then the main sentence, puella quae est in agro cantat, the girl is singing. So the girl who is in the field is singing. But then look what happens when the grammatical relationship inside the relative clause sort of flips around a bit. So you might have dominus quem amamus miser est. Dominus, the master. Relative clause, quem amamus. Now, quem is accusative, masculine, singular. It's masculine and singular because it's referring back to dominus, okay, the master, but it's accusative because in this relative clause, quem amamus, it is in fact the object of the verb in the relative clause, amamus. Amamus means we love, quem amamus, whom we love. And then it goes on, miser est is miserable or unhappy. So the master is unhappy, but it is the master whom we love is unhappy. And then a slightly more kind of complicated one, dominus cuius servus fessus est iratus semper est. Okay, dominus, there's your subject, the master. So we've got this relative clause, comma off, and beginning with a relative pronoun. Cuius servus fessus est, whose slave is tired. Okay, so in that relative clause, you've got a servus fessus est, the slave is tired. So there's your main little bit, the servant is tired, servus fessus est. But cuius servus fessus est, of whom the slave is tired. So we don't in English often say of whom, we say whose. So the master, whose slave is tired, and then it carries on, iratus semper est, is always angry. Okay, so they're a little bit tricky. One great thing, of course, about learning relative clauses in Latin is it teaches you quite a lot more about your own language. So, for example, the word whom. When you hear people saying, I think you mean whom rather than who, to an extent they're being fussy, possibly even pompous. But what's important is they are being accurate. Because the English word whom is an accusative case. And if you say, the girl whom I saw yesterday is called Michelle, you're saying whom because in the relative clause, whom I saw yesterday, actually, she was the object of the relative clause. I saw Michelle. Michelle, whom I saw yesterday. The girl whom I saw yesterday is called Michelle. Okay, so the word whom is an important kind of word to get your head around in English. It's used when it is the object in a relative clause, but it's also used after prepositions. So by whom and with whom, and in whom and to whom. Okay, so don't sneer at people who say whom. It's just that they understand the language and probably have learnt a bit of Latin at some stage. Okay, now we're going to do another session on relative clauses next time because this is complicated stuff. It's really important because they are massively common in Latin. You see relative clauses all over the place. And in fact, the more you think about it, now that we've focused on them a bit, you'll notice they're incredibly common in English as well. They tell us more about a noun, and so we use them the whole time. Okay, hope that made sense. Let me know if you have any problems, and I'll see you back on this channel very soon for another session on relative clauses.